We'll do the group conversation. And John, you were here listening the whole day, and I want to start with just asking if there were any questions you wanted to pose to the other speakers, or ideas they raised that you wanted to riff on that were not part of your remarks.
I think without putting people on the spot, it's a question that like I say, bothers me both from a public sector and a private sector perspective, is how cognizant are people at the senior levels in the organization that this is not a business as usual time, and that the skill set that's represented in the records and governance community has some bearing on those challenges that are ahead. And again, without maybe embarrassing, that was running through my head, is how big is that gap?
Any volunteers?
So I can start pretty big. I think when it matters is when there's a real issue that an executive can say, oh, that does impact me. So I brought up an example earlier, unaccompanied children, and how we apply record keeping to the systems with that information. We received a letter from Lawrence Brewer a year and a half ago to our secretary. We still don't have a resolution on that, but the ACF CIO and executives there and the deputy assistant secretaries and our assistant secretary, now they are starting to understand what it means when we talk about record keeping and the responsibilities to the public of those records. So I think it's as it matters. As different issues come up, and we hear that a lot, do you want your agency to be in the news? Our executives will say no, but when they are in the news, that's when we get change.
And the only thing I would add to that from the NARA perspective is one of the things we've tried to stress is the role of the senior agency officials. And it's taken us, because that was a core part of M-1218, was to creating these senior agency officials for records management. So on one level, in the long run of government and information management, this is still a relatively new community. It's really been fully, I'd say, robust since 2014, 2015, in the middle of the cycle around M-1218. We want to engage, we're always constantly thinking about ways to engage that community more around this very issue, around the issue that you raised, John. Just how do we make people at the senior level understand this in a different way, and that things aren't the same. And I think, and Debbie's absolutely right. I think records management for too long has had too many sticks and not enough carrots.
Right.
And now we're starting to figure that out in terms of, so what are the opportunities that are there on the carrot side to help improve this?
So I think at HHS we have one senior agency official for records management, and across the government, same thing, we have one. So it's a political appointee, which makes records sometimes having it part of the politics and the transitions is not easy. So it's not easy for me. Part of our senior agency official's job is to make sure that he's doing, going to meetings at the National Archives, checking in with me and the rest of the records officers. So it is not easy for me to find opportunities to keep him in the know. I have to go through 10 different people to get my memos to him. We're only 2 people away from each other. So I try to, you mentioned earlier the annual report. Every time National Archives comes out with a bulletin for senior officials, or I try to make sure, hey, you received an email yesterday. By the way, this is why. So I try to make the conversation more from an information governance, and this is some of the topics that I think you want us to think about. Records on its own is records, but if you can tie it into those broader categories, there's other pieces of the president's management agenda that I try to put records in, maybe data as a strategic asset. There's other ones. Those are big, sexy things that our agencies are, President's Management Agenda, what can I do there? So and it's not easy, but I've been around there for a while, so I have some experience trying to elevate the conversation, but it's not easy.
And that's with Fermi, that's what we've been trying to do to get out to these other audiences and tie in with the President's Management Agenda, being involved in the Sharing Quality Services cross-agency priority goal, because that, as you said, that does get attention. And we've really gotten in front of, with going to the Shared Services Forum, we've actually made some pretty good impact by giving presentations there with people that are even above the senior agency officials for records management. So that we were trying to break into other spaces like that to get the word out, to make sure that these senior executives are aware of what they need to do.
And I want to open this up for audience questions here in just a moment, but I also want to give our other speakers the converse of the opportunity I just gave John. Is there anything that he teed up in his talk that you want to rebut, give an amen to, ask the follow-up question? No? I see the hesitation.
So Nara's perspective is always the use of records in presentations to drive home your point is right on the money.
Very good. And I have some questions as well, but I know we are short for time and there's been a lot of questions. I want to make sure that we open it up to the audience first. Questions you have for individual panelists or as the group? Yes, sir. We'll bring the microphone to you in just a moment. Coming on your right.
Hi there. Don Lovett from D.C. Government. What do you think is going to happen when the average CIO learns that the records that they're so casually treating today are the basis for their machine learning algorithms in the future?
Anyway, my point was just I think there's an emerging challenge where you can't digest information by machines if they're not comprehensible by machines, and we've got some work to do to make sure that happens.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am, here in the front. Just one moment.
I'm pretty loud anyway.
Yeah, the recording is part of the issue.
So in a previous position, it took me a year to upgrade my records and information management people because of the OPM classification standards. They make us sound like glorified secretaries. Please, from the field, if there are not 2210 elements in this new updated position description, you are killing us. And I know when it went out in the beginning, about 4 or 5 years ago, we all said the same thing. I am here to plead. The only reason my guys got upgraded was I looked at the 15 who was running it and said, you're right, in paper I'm a GS9. And I listed everything I knew to include Lean Six Sigma, networking, policy, everything else to do my job in the field. So please, 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 please get those 2210 elements in there.
So I am a 2210. And does that help me, which means that my job series is IT. So does that matter? I think for the work that I do, I look at everything as a project. How are we going to create a blueprint moving forward, or where's my project? So I applied that. For our records officers, they're not that senior. So for my team, for Office of the Secretary, I'm lucky that she got a GS-13, right? So to try to professionalize that and move it forward and make it a GS-14 or 15 responsibilities, so I think that's a challenge to get the funding for it, but I'm not quite sure how she would. I don't know if, as I move from paper to electronic, how I would justify a 14 or a 15. I don't know. So I mean, it looks like you had a strategy that you were able to. So you're saying that you wanted you were able to give them promotions, or?
They were GS-11s, but it took a year to get them to GS-12s, and this is in Florida because of that 308 license, because the personnel center said, no, you're only doing that.
So my HR office at HHS has said, I've asked if we could expand have the 308 for higher grades. They told me that they told me to be careful if I would be able to promote into GS 14s and 15s in the 308 series. That was from OPM. So I hear what you're saying. You know, how are you going to really have the qualifications and the skills with the school? You know, at bachelor's degrees and master's degrees, my team does not have that, and I think that they I don't know if they'd qualify.
Very good. Other questions for the group? I am surprised. We see one. You see someone I don't. Yes. No. Yeah.
Okay, I don't know if my question is more for Bob. So I'm Shannon with Defense Information Systems Agency. I think what I'd like to know is there technology that exists to, I guess, determine if, like, as we move to electronic records, like, duplication of the same records is a really big issue, and it costs money to store the records, and, like, you have to pay for the storage space, at least with DoD you do. So has there been any discussion on addressing, like, how we can make sure there's not 20 copies of the same document, the same final document, sitting around? I don't know. It's just a concern because of storage space. I know everyone tends to keep everything, and it's kind of like information overload, and then you have duplication with a lot of stuff that's unnecessary.
Was that for me, that question?
You can certainly answer
It's
first.
for anyone, but Bob was like, you're the contract individual, so.
I can take a quick stab at it and then probably flip it to John. So I would just say that is certainly part of the requirements development process, and that should be kind of baked into your statement of work, PWS, to kind of place that burden on the contractor or industry to really be thoroughly reviewing those documents and making sure that doesn't happen.
I don't know if maybe I don't understand the question.
I think you're after the question of every organization has ROT, redundant, obsolete, and trivial documents, and they try to figure out how to find those and identify those. And the answer is, without kind of naming particular vendors at this point, the answer is yes. There are a lot of those tools out there. They've gotten much more sophisticated in the last 2, 3, 4 years than they were before. In that regard, the technology is not really the problem. The problem becomes that everybody can look at somebody else's department and say, oh man, they've got so much rot over there, and you know they should get rid of that, and it's costing us all this money for storage, and you know all this kind of stuff. But then if somebody comes into my department, no, this stuff's mission critical, and I got to hang on to it for the foreseeable future. And so there's the diagnostic tools are there. There's a change management issue that says, okay, you know, what's the policy? What's the retention policy? What can we get rid of? And are we going to actually do it? That becomes the problem.
And just to put a plug in for Schedule 36, there are vendors on the ERM SIN that can do documents.
So I think another way to look at that is when we talked earlier about the life cycle of a record. So what we're trying to make sure that we do at HHS, that our records officers help employees and system owners declare that one record. What we do day to day with copies of those records, so when I leave the agency, when I leave and I move to another job, my office will just have my official records. If I want to keep copies, if I have email going back 20 years stored somewhere else, that's for me to manage and take with me or not. So I think what we're trying to incorporate at HHS is when you, and maybe it's the records officers to make that declaration, we are responsible for keeping that record. If your team or your office isn't giving additional space for files or for copies, then I guess I don't understand why it doesn't. I manage a lot of systems, and I'm curious about that record, not the copies. So that's a little bit when we talk about email, and if email is going to do record keeping, well, then do I need it? So that's for our individual records officers and agencies to declare, is the record the version that I have in Word, or is it the one that's in my sent items in my email? Make that decision, and I don't need that copy. So when I leave my job, and that's a big time when we decide at HHS, at least in Office of the Secretary, it's when our employees depart. It's when our senior executives are leaving. That's when we do the full completeness of their records. And that's a little late in the game to say what's the record versus what's the copy, but that is the reality of what we do today. And as long as we know that we have that copy, we don't sanction. If we have the record, I don't think it really matters to us. I don't want those copies.
So it's kind of that blurring line between permanent records, temporary records, information that you need to run the business. You know, you kind of those lines have all gotten blurred, and so it's hard to. There's actually a study by a group called the Corporate Governance Oversight Council, CGOC, that is in the private sector, but I think it relates to public sector as well, in which they conclude that 2/3 of the information that companies have and that they're managing and that they're paying to manage is junk. And only 1/3 is actually necessary for business purposes and for legal and compliance purposes and for records purposes. And everything else is just stuff that's accumulated.
So I want to push on that a little bit, and I'm going to overstate this deliberately. On one side, there is that compliance and records management. It's 7 years for this email, and you know, there may be other uses for it, but at the end of the day, the obligations and the costs of storing it, you need to set those boundaries. At the other end of the extreme is what you were talking about, John, of how do you create value in this space, and not just be the archivist, but be the data curator that lets an agency create new value. That, on the surface, seems to be about let's gather, organize as much data as possible, and figure out how to run the algorithms on it, how to find the new insights. How do you balance that when there's this very clear mandate that has to be met, but it could take you down this path of just being the record keeper and digital boxes on shelves?
Well, I guess there's this, we hear it all the time, and it's particularly the case with younger people of, storage is cheap, just save everything, and we'll find it with Google later on. And there's also a vein that runs through a lot of conversations where people coming from a machine learning perspective say like, oh, well, we're kind of loath to get rid of stuff because who knows what value we might be able to mine from that downstream. And that's, that tension exists against, first of all, how do you separate stuff that needs to be saved permanently versus something that has tangential value? And then also, how do you keep that tangential stuff from accumulating to such a degree that your systems become very, very difficult to sustain, either from a cost perspective or a findability perspective or whatever. So I don't have an easy answer to that. I think that is a key tension to explore.
Okay. Other thoughts on that? Yeah.
Well, and you also, I know that in my previous experience at an agency, we'd also emphasize the fact that you're opening yourself up for a lot of risk by keeping a lot of data that you no longer need, or lots of copies when you think you've disposed of the original, but you've got lots of copies laying around. You're opening yourself up to, longer times to respond to FOIA requests. We try to tie in with FOIA too that, a good records management program, it's going to take you a much shorter amount of time to respond to these FOIA requests if you have a records manager that knows where things are and is everything managed appropriately, and also e-discovery as well. You can really reduce e-discovery costs for agencies if you have a really robust records management program and everything's under control and being maintained.
And I think the only thing I would say, part of that, when we talk about litigation holds, and a couple of us had this conversation earlier, so the process is Department of Justice will contact our Office of General Counsel, and then we'll get our executives at those agencies, and I will get an email, hey, anyone in your office who has materials relating to this, they're on a hold. How we implement those litigation holds, not always, it's not consistent, but also how we get the communication when the hold is lifted. What do you do with this massive amount? We don't know. And this just came up a couple days ago, so I think that, great question. I don't know if we...
We'll have another panel on that at a later
yeah.
date.
It's hard stuff.
I see a question here. Yes, ma'am. Oh. Let's try one other, and then I'll restate the question if that doesn't.
Hi, I have a question for Nara. With the deadline of 2022 coming up, is NARA have any initiatives or plans to help agencies update their legacy schedules, record schedules? Because a lot of us have a lot of old, outdated record schedules that are not media neutral. So as we're trying to stay compliant with NARA and also move towards ERM, we're facing the challenge of submitting new schedules and being told we've got a 1 to 2 year wait before they're approved.
So part of the suite of updated guidance that we're talking about issuing and is a piece on media neutral scheduling. That is another tool that's going to help agencies reach compliance, go towards compliance. So I think it's just fair to say that it's on our radar. It's something we will be addressing, that specific piece.
Okay. And I think we're going to need to leave the questions there.